I understand in a way why there's some people on the kind of post-left who say, what are you being critical of? This is great. Like the consensus is gone. All bets are off. Like neoliberalism has been killed by its own makers. Why aren't we, ourselves like tap dancing the streets now? Because like a window has been opened for a brave and interesting new world. Reason I'm not joining them is because the way that the game is still being rigged, I think, is, extraordinarily weighted against ordinary working people. And the kinds of experimentation they're doing right now is still designed in such a way to maximally enrich a very small group of insiders and to maximally dispossess and make life harder for the larger group of outsiders.
Why does Elon Musk have so many kids? Is Argentina's Javier Milei secretly adored by all those economic elites he professes to despise? And should you put your money in gold or cryptocurrency? These might seem like a hodgepodge of disconnected questions, but actually they're linked. They're all part of how neoliberalism has been reinvented by the far right for the 21st century. I'm joined by Quinn Slobodian, a historian and author, to talk about how the heirs of Friedrich Hayek, the neoliberal philosopher of the 20th century, misinterpreted and strategically distorted his way of thinking to make room for skull-measuring calipers and race science. We cover pickup artists, smash and grab economics, the right's obsession with IQ, and Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. I really hope you enjoy the interview, but before you start watching it, give us a comment. Why not subscribe? We really want to hear from you. Who do you want to see interviewed on this channel next? And if you really like the work we're doing, go to novaramedia.com/support and become one of our monthly donors. We couldn't do any of this without you, and we appreciate every single penny. Quinn Slobodian, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Happy to be here.
And when we were doing the research for this interview, we noticed that you disappeared from Twitter. Is it because of Elon Musk's takeover? Have you just decided to become psychologically healthy? Where's that come from?
Yeah, probably a long overdue purge of a sometimes unproductive slice or even hefty swath of my everyday life.
What's the trick to not wanting to go on? Is there one?
No, I really think that as the neoliberals knew, we need to bind Ulysses to the mast. And there needs to be some kind of a external constraint, which usually means having a loved one make a new password that you do not know.
Yeah, my partner's often offered that, but I can't give up football Twitter. It's the most toxic part of my personality. You write intellectual histories about people who've had big ideas, the conditions that produce those ideas and those people, and then what's happened as those ideas have been metabolized, digested, and what kind of comes out generation through generation. If you turned that methodology back on yourself and you tried to think about the circumstances and historical forces and ideas that made you, what are the ones that you would identify?
Well, I was raised, among other places, on a very small island off of another island. So it's a place called Alert Bay off of Vancouver Island off the west coast of Canada. And
so that's like the Isle of Wight of Canada.
I guess so. But what happened, you are struck even more by the weirdness of settler colonialism when there are these traces of white people places where white people shouldn't have been. And most specifically where I was taking my first classes was in a former residential school. So it had been a place where, indigenous kids had been taken forcibly from their homes and had only closed down about 5 or 6 years before. So this is.
And did you know about that when you were at school there?
It was still on native land, and most of the kids in my class were. So I didn't know about the residential schools. I found out about that later, but it was later torn down ceremonially by the residents of the island, stoned and then demolished, and after being painted over. So that was, something that, I had this sense of being raised at the edge of some legacy of violence and some legacy of encounter. And then we moved to Lesotho, Southern Africa, shortly thereafter. It's a little landlocked country in the middle of what was then apartheid South Africa. So we would cross over sometimes with Black friends who would have a different experience, obviously, the moment they crossed the border. So the idea that you could have these small geographies that were like burdened with histories and burdened with different understandings of what order meant was not hard to.
If you're how old were you when you guys moved to Lesotho?
6.
6. So when you were a kid and, you can see apartheid from your house, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're right next door to apartheid South Africa. How do you begin to make sense of that? What did your family say to you about what was going on?
Well, my family was also, and this would be other, I guess, important part of my formation. They were part of a pretty obscure religion called the Baha'i Faith, which is a kind of Islam meets Unitarianism is usually how I try to describe it to people who don't know much about that. So it has its own belief system, its own scripture, its texts, and also a very strong belief in things like racial unity, equality of the sexes. So it was very much a talking point. Like, we are in a place, Lesotho, that has a kind of interracial cooperation, harmony that is very much unlike over there, a few miles that way across the border. And when we were, as I was saying, with Black friends, it was pretty stark. They weren't served when we went into places that would have been served in Lesotho. And it wasn't hard to perceive, even from the eyes of a child, that kind of, ostracization.
Your PhD and your first book was on the radical empathy, or the solidarity between students and their equivalents from the global South. Where do you think that radical empathy has gone? Do you think that we're better at sort of cross-identification and seeing the self in the other, or worse at it?
It's a good question. I mean, that book came out of my own sense of despair during the Iraq War. So 2003, the invasion of Iraq by the United States and its coalition was a striking moment, because there was no real connection between even anti-war activists in the US and the people on the receiving end of the Bradley fighting vehicles and Tomahawk missiles. It didn't seem like solidarity was being built on the basis of actual personal connections or identifications beyond quite abstract ones based on humanitarianism. And looking back at the 1960s, which is what that first book was about, it seemed like there was actually a much more developed understanding of the people on the other side. There were narratives from the side of the Viet Cong. There was the people coming from North and South Vietnam to Western Europe, creating personal ties of solidarity. And then in some extreme cases, of course, people were seeing themselves, young, white, ethnically German leftists were seeing themselves as like members of the Red Guard, or, members of the Tupamaros, Uruguay. And those moments of, radical empathy, hence the title of the dissertation, seemed to be few and far between in the early 2000s. And it was something that I've tried to explore historically. I don't think that it's really been solved. Obviously, we're in the midst of a much more bloody and violent conflict with the Israel-Gaza one-sided war. And I'm not sure if those problems have been solved this time around either. Although I would say I think there, as the capacity of communication and the new infrastructures to allow for people to post from the front lines and to even write things that can then be published it's a step beyond where we were at in the early 2000s.
I mean, do you think that maybe technology might be part of the problem, which is that it turns you into a spectator rather than someone who has to learn through meeting people? You go, okay, well, I can see this and I can see the images, and during the time of the Iraq War, it would have been cable news and stuff like that. Well, I can see it. Whereas 60s and 70s, yes, of course, you had moving image on the news, but if you really wanted to have a deep understanding of what the Viet Cong were doing or what they stood for, they kind of had to come out to meet you. And that's what happened with the Black Panthers and the Viet Cong, for instance.
Yep. Yeah, there was some of that. And that ended up being actually the kind of twist of the book, is that we think about New Left radical romanticism and people falling in love with the poster of Che Guevara, or having these projections of what was happening in distant Beijing. But the twist of the book was that actually there were a lot of people from the global South on West German university campuses, largest group being Iranians. And the anti-Shah protests by Iranian dissident students ended up being actually kind of the powder keg in West Germany that kicked off the student movements in 67 and 68. So my argument was there was actually this forgotten story of face-to-face encounter that we should see as the more, in some ways, the more meaningful and enduring form of solidarity, rather than just, the pipe dreams and longings of a more exotic and beautiful place.
I mean, did you have any of that, though, when you were younger? Was there a poster of a revolutionary and you'd look up at them and you'd be like, I'm going to be like you, cuz? Like...
Not really. I wasn't really like a teenage leftist. I think maybe I was like a punk, and maybe in the 90s, there was much more of a subcultural kind of more anarchist dropout culture. And the long shadow of even like the Beats, I think, was still quite strong in the 90s. I feel like now, in retrospect, disturbing ways, people were orienting themselves still to like Kerouac and Burroughs and Gary Snyder and Ferlinghetti and people like that. So I didn't long for conflict. I mean, partially maybe because I had been in places that I was in Lesotho when there was a coup. So the idea of a war wasn't particularly sexy to me. It was something that you'd want to avoid. So I understood that longing, but I was also, I think, because of having had the good fortune of, traversing those borders and meeting people different than me, having kids as my best friends from all over the world, I was also curious about the capacity of those kind of interpersonal relations to be more meaningful kernels of solidarity.
This new book, Hayek's Bastards, which is like, it's so good. I really, really, really enjoyed it. It looks at the ways in which, the new far right, you call them new fusionists, they've taken the ideas of Hayek and somehow misinterpreted them, distorted them, read Hayek through the lens of extremely motivated reasoning and come up with, some very different political conclusions. And you talk about the three hards. I mean, what are the three hards?
The three hards, and that is actually kind of borrowing from Maoist language that likes to say like, the three this and the four that. So that was kind of like a cheeky, I guess, carryover from the early New Left stuff I've been reading.
So when you were writing, you were like a little something for the Maoists?
Yeah, kind of. And the little like, I mean, often we're just making jokes for ourselves, right? I mean, that's the fun of writing, I think. So things that I find amusing later are worth it. And also, as a sidebar, I've discovered as a historian, it's often the things that make you laugh in the archive that are the things you need to stick with, because you're like, why did that? What is the absurdity there that is like calling to me? And rather than just turning to the next document, it's like, all right, we're gonna have to figure out what made me laugh.
Marx's footnotes, and he's just like beefing some like forgotten German economist. And he's like, you prig.
yeah, exactly. No, there's like athletic pleasure in that too. So the three hards though are the idea of hardwired human nature, the idea of hard borders, and the idea of hard money. And all three of those are in some ways bastardizations of the OG neoliberal thought that one associates with Friedrich Hayek. For those, who are not up on who Friedrich Hayek is, he was a British-Austrian economist and political philosopher born in the Habsburg Empire in 1899, moved here to London in the 1930s, taught at the London School of Economics, is often put in contrast with John Maynard Keynes. There's like this model of Keynes versus Hayek that is quite beloved of trade press authors and documentarians. The idea being Keynes wanted a mixed economy, a welfare state. Hayek wanted a deregulated economy and much more laissez-faire free market, which is true as far as it goes. But often the story doesn't go long enough to get to the kind of people I write in my book. And by the time you get to the 90s, when this new crop of more hard right neoliberals emerges, on those 3 points, they've all taken like pretty hard turns. So hard, many hards there. But one of the first one, the human nature one, is the idea that people have certain capacities like written into their DNA. And that's not something that Hayek himself ever claimed. He talked about cultural evolution, but he wouldn't have said that some people are like genetically coded for, a certain kind of capitalist virtue or certain kinds of intelligence. Hard borders. He was actually supportive of Thatcher's hard immigration stance in the late 1970s.
Was that from belief or from pragmatism?
It was from pragmatism, exactly. So, I mean, I have written about neoliberals and the immigration question in the past, an article called Perfect Capitalism, Imperfect Humans, because the feeling was often that, it would be great. It would be very useful, actually, if we could just let people go where the market called to them, but that there are certain preconditions for social stability that can get in the way of. And neoliberals are always very engaged with this idea of what they call the meta market. It's not just the market requires certain conditions to happen. And sometimes those things include making compromises towards people's xenophobic attitudes, towards their sense of unease about people who they feel like are visibly different than them. And when Hayek was supporting Thatcher's exclusionist stance, he was saying something similar. Like back in Austria, when the Jews from the East arrived, they didn't fit in even with the Jews of the capital because they were culturally different. So I realized that, as unfortunate as it is, people take some time to trust people other than themselves. So let's stick with a more arm's length attitude towards immigrants.
You've also got Enoch Powell, who, I think he spent some time with the OG neoliberal philosophers of, the Mont Pelerin Society.
Yes.
And of course, his speech, Rivers of Blood, is sort of the totemic anti-immigration moment in British politics.
Yes.
And even though he had to resign from the Conservative front bench, his ideas really did shape, Thatcher's that authoritarian streak and her rhetoric on immigration.
Yeah, so he was really a forerunner of the kind of people that I'm writing about in the 1990s, but at that time was quite by himself. So that was a minority position. He was even seen as a bit of a odd duck inside of like the Mont Pelerin Society milieu because of how much he prioritized that question of, ethnic exclusion, homogeneity. But by the 90s, you have more people saying, this is good. There's actually good economic reason to keep out people from certain ethnic and racial backgrounds because they are, quote, hardwired for this or that and not this or that. We need to, engineer a population that's going to be more efficient and productive. And that means putting on the racial goggles and then even absorbing a lot of the new genetic science that's coming into, the popular eye by the 1990s. The Human Genome Project is completed at the end of the decade. And that turn towards the authority of science is something that wasn't really the case for neoliberals and conservatives for much of the post-war period. They'd be much more likely to appeal to religion. That was the original version of the fusionists. The new fusionists is when, instead of mixing markets and traditional morality and religion, they're interested in mixing markets and appeals to the sciences, sociology, psychology, biology, ethology, sociobiology, all of these new wings of discipline.
I mean, just to sort of go back to the three hards for a second. So hard borders, hardwired human difference, hard money, gold, the obsession with gold, is that it sort of seems to me that these things also offer a sort of anchor and solidness when neoliberalism and marketization is all about things speeding up, becoming more liquid, more transient, and more, less permanent. Yeah. And so is some of it an articulation for a longing for like things you can hold on to and make sense of and touch, and they feel concrete and in front of you?
Absolutely.
Rather than just everything gets faster, everything gets more fleeting.
Yeah, no, I've seen it. It's in a way, it's a reckoning with the kind of world that their own policies had helped produce, right? I mean, when you've advocated for deregulation, you've advocated for the unleashing of financial markets, you've advocated for delinking originally currencies from the hard money of the hard currency of the hard metal of gold, I should say, and then now you realize the sense of unrootedness and disorder that can produce in society, then you seek a return now. How can we restabilize what has been sort of set free? And that would seem to be what Polanyi would call like a double movement. Like, the human relations have been disembedded, turned into commodities, and now they need to be re-embedded. That is a common way to understand what the far right is it's an attempt to provide a sense of security in an insecure world. And it does so as often from the right as it does from the left. However, one of the things that I do in the book is to use this metaphor from the financial press, which is the idea of a flight to safety. which is a way that they would phrase exactly what you're describing. Usually that means like there's turbulence, there's volatility. What do? You flee to gold, you flee to, at least until recently, American treasuries, or, you seek refuge in something that has had a capacity to hold its value over the long durée. And I see far-right politics as kind of like that. It's not an attempt to exit the market or exit commodification. You think about it more in the financial press's terms, it's about saying, how can I flee one asset class for another? And actually, in the 90s, a lot of these neoliberals start to present whiteness, start to present territory, start to present other things as a kind of asset class. Steve Bannon, who I wouldn't quite include in this category, but is nevertheless interesting to think with in some ways, says we need to move from shareholder value to citizenship value, which I think is very telling because it's not decommodification, right? It's not rejecting monetization. It's actually deepening that idea of pricing into one's very national belonging. And so I think that appearance of escape that actually deepens our dependency and our connectedness to market logics is exactly the sort of twist I was trying to unpack there.
I want to come back to Steve Bannon because it's like, that's not a name you hear much anymore. You really got, left behind
maybe around here
for a younger model, you know what I mean? But did you ever hear about the Gordon Brown sold off the gold thing?
No.
So it's something that you hear a lot in this country, and it's this idea which has sort of attained a mythical status is, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, he sold off Britain's gold. And it was the kind of thing that you would hear from Leave voters, Brexit voters, in the run-up to 2016 when we voted Brexit. It was this idea that there was a national betrayal. And I think now that you put it in the terms of a flight to safety, that he got rid of our safety. This thing which was anchoring us as a nation, he got rid of it. And that was a big part of how Leave voters thought about what had gone wrong in the country. I mean, are there any other sort of myths like that centering on gold in modern politics that you can identify in the global north?
Absolutely. No, that's actually one of the crazier things that I ended up coming across in the course of writing this book is the fetishism of gold is odd, actually, in an era after the gold standard and after the decoupling of the dollar from gold. So since 1971, technically speaking, you can't go to the bank anywhere in the world and be obliged to be given a certain amount of gold in exchange for the currency.
Can I have some bullion, please?
Right, exactly. Like that was very normal at the end of the 19th century. Even in the US, you had a steady pegged price for gold to the dollar until 1971. But since then, no, we're in a world of fiat currency. We're in a world where currency is backed only by people's confidence in the central banks to, keep the value of that currency up. And if you don't like it, you're free to exchange it into some other currency. The idea that nevertheless, you still had inside of Federal Reserves and banks, big piles of gold bars is a kind of affront to the idea that we had ever entirely left our fascination with gold. In fact, there was still some social, symbolic, or even economic fixation or attachment on that thing, which outlived its actual role in anchoring the world monetary system.
I mean, big time. I mean, so this gold chain I've had since I was born because the tradition in Desi cultures is you give the baby a gift of gold or wedding rings or don't know if you've ever been on a flight with South Asians, which is stopped off in Dubai because there will be a stampede to buy some cheap gold. Like it's so culturally embedded. So culturally embedded.
Yeah. And in fact, part of Dubai's rise was specifically by smuggling gold from Switzerland to Dubai and then people in fishing skiffs, like sending them to India for, mostly wedding ceremonies. And the Swiss people were actually creating bars in the specific form of measurement that was used in India in preparation for that smuggling, operation. Wow. And India actually comes into it in an interesting way because one of the things that I came across, which is a more extreme version of the Gordon Brown took the gold story or sold the gold, is in Germany, in the Federal Republic, during the Cold War, the gold was held in the United States because the fear was that the Soviets came in, boom, they also take all the West German
They've done
gold.
it once before.
Yes, exactly. They're right there, etc. Oh, some things are actually true. So after the Cold War, it would seem, well, we could bring the gold back. But nobody was particularly invested in doing that because, as I just said, it's ultimately just like an ornamental part. It's not that important in the world economy anymore by the 1990s and 2000s. In the 2010s, a precious metals consultant starts a campaign called Bring Our Gold Home. And his argument is that, the Western occupying powers came in. They were never really legitimate. They have absconded with Germany's wealth, and now they refuse to give it back, probably because they've melted it down and done something else with it. So, like, let's get the gold back. The tabloid press started getting behind the campaign, and then, believe it or not, the Bundesbank did it. So they actually brought back a bunch of the gold bars from the United States and put them on display.
They're like the most expensive shipping operation we've ever fucking done.
Yeah. No, and they said, like, here it is, doubt no more. And of course, because the whole logic of conspiracy, it's exactly like Obama's birth certificate. Like, to show proof is not enough because it's only evidence that you're actually covering over a
Could
deeper
every citizen like
conspiracy.
bite it to see if it was real or something?
Yeah, no, you could actually go in and put it in your hand and lift it up and so on. That this guy was able to continue his campaign and now is in the Bundestag in the German parliament through his second election as the delegate from Munich for the Alternative for Germany party.
Wow.
And this idea of skepticism about the ability of the state to manage money, leading to a fixation on the idea that gold is the true bearer of value, was a big part of the Alternative for Germany's early fundraising operations, where they would actually sell Krugerrands and Canadian maple coins to AfD buyers in return for matching funds to fund their campaign from the central government.
I mean, how does cryptocurrency fit into all of this? Because I'm not going to lie to people. I don't fucking understand cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
I find it confusing. I don't get it.
Yeah.
But I understand sort of socially and culturally it has this power, particularly amongst young working class men who are like, okay, well, the real economy, who's making money in the real economy, right? I don't have inherited wealth. I'm not going to be able to be, part of that 0.1% who becomes like an incredible footballer or an amazing rapper. But there's crypto. There's crypto. And it's basically a form of gambling and it's about moving quickly. And I think I can do that. How are the stories around cryptocurrencies and also the fact that so many of the figures who you talk about in the book, like Elon Musk, push their own cryptocurrencies. Like, what is this doing in the political imaginary?
Well, it comes from the same original impulse, which is to say that whoever's managing the economy now is doing it in an unsustainable way. And they're doing it on the basis of like making the printing presses go burr, to fund their social programs, to, pay off their elite class, to pay off the working class, and that this is going to lead to a monetary collapse, sooner or later, and probably sooner. So a party like the AfD gets its start because the Eurozone crisis happens, and they see Merkel as they understand it, bailing out, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, and so you need to go back to the Deutschmark, you need to go back to gold, and that was the India connection for a while. For a moment, Germany outpaced India for private gold buying, which they had never done until then. And it was totally in a way of expressing a lack of confidence in the ability of the technocrats to actually manage the currency. So the original idea of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency was the same, which is that you want to build something that is deflationary. It's a finite amount of currency and value, and it cannot be expanded by the discretionary decision making of policymakers. And so therefore, first people in are going to have an advantage because the currency's value will go up. The quasi currencies, the tokens value will go up as more and more people want it and as fewer and fewer are minted. And so you can use it as a way to hedge against what you think will probably be the collapse of conventional currencies. And in the meantime, you can maybe either hold it or trade it. And there's a real incentive to be in there first. So that there was an ideology behind it originally, which is that as with gold, we're kind of building a store of value for like the day after the collapse. But the gold bugs are able to project a little bit more realistically in the sense that, let's say society does end tomorrow and you did want to like trade your necklace for like whatever, a gallon of water, then you could theoretically do that. Whereas trying to like
I've got a screenshot of a smoking ape.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give me some
Yeah,
antibiotics?
like here is my hash for the Coinbase exchange that's offshore in Singapore. Like I didn't know how you were even supposed to do that the day after. So there's a cynicism to the crypto that arguably gold bugs are a bit more sincere about their vision of where things are going. Incidentally, if you want the best depiction of this in fiction, it's Lionel Shriver, who is, I think, a great far-right author at this point. I mean, she has the book The Mandibles, which is about exactly what I'm describing. You need to hoard gold because the currency's going. And then her more recent book is about the need to, reestablish a belief in the hierarchy of IQ, which is a chapter in this book as well.
We are absolutely gonna get to IQ, but I just want to because he made reference to this idea that currencies have been devalued. They're just propping up these big state programs, and it's sort of where you begin the book, which is it should be this victorious moment, right? In the early 90s, communism's been defeated, the Berlin Wall comes down, but instead the neoliberals feel precarious, insecure. And I can't remember who says it, but it was such a great line. If socialism is dead, then why isn't it lying down? Why did they feel that way? Why weren't they just going around like we fucking won?
Yeah. I mean, they were just looking at the budget numbers. And if you actually look at the percentage of state spending relative to GDP, it didn't really change after the end of the Cold War, especially like entitlement spending, thinking about like the persistence of something like the NHS here in the UK. People often look at the Thatcher-Reagan decades and conclude that actually the welfare state wasn't really dismantled as such. It was, re-engineered, workfare was introduced, it was made less reliable in all kinds of ways. But the state still is a very big part of the economy in advanced industrialized nations. And for these neoliberals, that was like the final boss. Like, how do you kill the Leviathan in your own home country? Forget the Soviet Union. It's been supine. Never thought that was going to work in the first place. But what about this mixed economy that continues to exist here at home? And then the question becomes, who is propping this thing up? They're not actual communists. We don't really have any. They're not actual socialists in the US, especially. You just don't really have any in out of prominence. So they start looking for other, cheerleaders for the current order. So they see civil rights activists, they see feminists, they see gay rights activists, they see environmentalists, all now as like the shock troops of the new socialism, which defines itself not in terms of worker rights and redistribution, but like regulation, policing codes of conduct, and then, pushing forward candidates from their minority group for representation and special treatment as they see it in the workplace and in the world of higher education and leadership.
And, particularly in the UK, it was the era of quangos. So we had the Equalities and Human Rights Commission set up by Blair. And it was a way of, instead of having these big anti-racist movements with strong links to the trade union movement, you had a quango who'd be like, okay, we've come up with a policy paper about, what kind of language is deemed acceptable in the workplace. Yeah, that's what we're going to do.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because I think a way of thinking about this period that probably a lot of Novara viewers and listeners would be familiar with is the one that Nancy Fraser describes as progressive neoliberalism, right? So often people rightfully would look at the 90s and 2000s and say like, wow, good job, capital. Like, you really successfully defanged and co-opted all of these like potentially subversive and radical demands and just turned it into like a little bit more melanin in the boardroom and like a little bit of this here, there, cultural spending, whatever. The people that I write about were never convinced that progressive neoliberalism was adequate or that it would stay at a steady state. They thought that that was always opening the door to more and more demands. And that if you open the door a crack for, let's say, attention to climate change or global warming, then before you know it, you would have people like questioning the whole growth model, asking whether or not it was possible to decarbonize under capitalism, like all of these very legitimate questions, which we know, other guests on your show have asked and continue to ask. So they saw a more radical critique coming in a way, which you could say was kind of insightful of them, that they saw that there would always be people who would want to push that further and wouldn't be happy with just this halfway settlement.
I mean, it was really astonishing reading this book and like coming across some names where I'm like, wow, I've not thought about this person for a long time. And one such person was Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve. And it was an absolute monster blockbuster hit. There was something like 400,000 copies in print by the mid-90s. And so I suppose I've got two questions. Like, one is, what was so important about that book for the new fusionists, as you call them? And the second is, if you go back to 1995, it was Charles Murray versus Dinesh D'Souza, who's now seen as like a total crackpot, right? You know, he's doing his PragerU stuff, but Dinesh D'Souza came out with a book called The End of Racism, which said, no, the bell curve is wrong to say that black failure in America is because of genes. So yeah, why was the book so important? And if you look at that sort of Dinesh D'Souza versus, you know, Charles Murray thing, do you think that really the Charles Murrays of the world won out because Dinesh D'Souza had to come his way further into Fruit Loop land?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, Charles Murray to me is a fascinating case because of how he himself changed over time. So he came onto the scene with a different kind of an argument, which was based on actually behavioral psychology and behavioral economics. The idea was, why do, you know, young women have babies? Well, because they know that it's pleasurable for them and that the state will pay for the Pampers, you know, even if the father leaves or whatever. So we need to be aware that everything is just pain and pleasure nexuses, and we need to make sure that we don't incentivize pleasurable behavior that might be corrosive of social order and produce more state spending. That's quite different, actually, than the argument he made in The Bell Curve, and which came out in 1994, co-authored with the Harvard psychologist Richard Herrnstein. By that book, he's saying it's not even about reward and punishment or incentives. It's about the fact that people are born with a certain capacity, and it's basically baked in almost automatically. So no matter what you do with, you know, early childhood intervention, nutrition, you know, enrichment, Head Start, you know, getting kids into better schools that are, you know, not totally segregated by socioeconomic status, in the end, you're going to have the same outcome anyway. And those outcomes are very handily just ranked hierarchically on a list of that maps onto racial groups, as he understood it. So you can just make a pyramid in which Ashkenazi Jews and Asians are on the top, then whites come below them, and African Americans and Latinos come at the bottom. And if we take that seriously, he's arguing, then it's kind of a cold splash of water over all these demands for social uplift and progressive reform and social spending and testing. It's all kind of a waste of time. In the end, you know, everyone is going to be as unequal as they were born, so we need to start living with that. So there's a hard, like, realism that's also an attempt to shoot an arrow into the heart of any possibility of egalitarian outcomes. And I think that for a lot of people who had seen decades of attempts at social reform, been disheartened by the continuation of inequality, it was, for a kind of middle-brow audience who bought those hundreds of thousands of copies, it was a great sigh of relief. Like, okay, finally, now we know why it hasn't been working. And look, he's got all the data to prove it. And look, his co-author's from Harvard, so it must all be true, right? So it just offered like a very convenient, apparently scientifically based way to just opt out of the whole efforts at producing a more equal country.
I'm going to say something incredibly snobby.
Yeah.
So, like, forgive me.
Please.
But, like, how much of the appeal of something like The Bell Curve, or the thing that you hear now, which is, you know, oh, you're just low IQ and I'm high IQ. How much of all of this is just about feeding the ego of the white middle class and middle brow? You know, it's ego stroking. It's a dumb person's idea of something clever.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is part of it. Like, there's definitely like a mystique around bad science as reproduced in, you know, graphs, charts, apparently scientific, you know, YouTube reels. I saw one recently that was trying to convince the viewer of the science of why, like, Danish women were better looking than Swedish women or something like that. Like, and it like reproduced like all of these, like the prognathy of the jaw and like a dotted line, you know, and a forward pointing chin adds 17% of attraction, like this kind of thing, where it was absolutely that. It's just like pandering to some dude who's like, huh, yeah, that's true. I get it now.
That's why I do find her really hot.
Yeah. So part of it is that, just like backfilling preconceptions and prejudice with just schlocky data. And the interesting thing about it, though, is sometimes they're even open about that. So some of the things that I have them saying is like, we need to trust our instincts more. So, if you don't feel good around that person of a different race, hey, don't let them convince you you're wrong. Maybe you're right. And you know what? Here's the science to prove it. And that's often where something like evolutionary psychology came in. This is why, part of the book is talking about like our patrimony and our minds of our millennia on the savannah, because the idea
Savannah
is
stories,
the savannah story is all over this. So the idea that we all still have this sort of caveman brain that's telling us, I am man, I want this from woman, and I don't recognize stranger, kind of a thing, is like, stop fighting it, let it happen, and we can even explain to you that that's all well grounded in scientific theory. So that retroactive justification is clearly a big part of this, like looked at from any distance whatsoever. But that itself is a variation on the neoliberal theme. So, they hadn't really done that before, like tried to make arguments for free markets or economic freedom, or for that matter, immigrant exclusion, based on some half-assed idea of science. And now they very frequently do.
When I was, reading what you had to say about Savannah stories, and I just thought it's such a great phrase. And so this idea that, men understand space in a certain way in case they have to throw a spear to bring down a mammal.
Sure.
I was just like looking at like my housemate, just being like, bruv, you ain't throwing no spears. There's like no spears. Yeah. And, women have particular kinds of memory because we have to remember what kinds of plants are poisonous. And I was like, I don't know.
Also, not going to work.
Not happening. I was like, okay, well, like clearly we're dying on the savannah. But it made me think a little bit about the messages that you get through, I suppose, like pickup artistry.
Oh, yeah.
The language of like looks maxing, and the way in which evolutionary psychology comes into it to be like, okay, well, if you're a man and you find dating and romance, like everybody, daunting, you're scared of rejection, other people's emotional reactions are confusing to you. You just have to do these things because it's embedded in a woman's psychology that she's going to respond like this. If you're saying, well, these things also have their origins in neoliberalism, like what are maybe the neoliberal components of that sort of like mad dating science shit?
Yeah. So I'd say a couple things about that. I mean, one of the things that I think made the bell curve such a success and made this turn to scientific argument so popular in the 1990s and into the 2000s is because I think there was more generally like a rising prestige in the world of, trade paperbacks and middle brow literature for the idea that science held a certain truth, and that there were new discoveries in science that were revealing new truths to us that had previously been hidden. So this idea of like neuroscience as a determinative thing, the idea that we are depressed not because of something that happened to us in our lives or because the world is a terrible place, but because we have a chemical imbalance, so we just need to pop a pill. And that was the big 90s topic, right? Like Prozac Nation and all that stuff. So first of all, it wasn't like the neoliberals who were doing this as much as I think they were correctly observing that there was a rising prestige of science that they could help use to legitimize their arguments. And that actually connects to the pseudoscience of the pickup artist too, because the other part of the present political moment I think I'm trying to help uncover a bit is in the last chapter, which is about the world of investment advice, right? So it's not just I've got the good science, it is that, but it's also I've got the good science, which is also a way that you can get an edge on the coming crisis or the coming catastrophe and prove everyone else a sucker and get rich while doing it. So at some point, they're talking about this wave of predictions of the coming collapse, and that you'll be able to use like a gold coin to buy a city block in Manhattan, and that would have the twin satisfactions of both having been right, which is very big, libidinally and psychologically, but then also suddenly being very wealthy. So a lot of this catastrophe libertarianism, which is very much part of the crypto world, and being in like the last person holding the bag, means like you have to grind and hustle to make sure that nobody gets it over on you, is I think a very important ideology for also like conscripting a lot of people who might otherwise not see themselves as like downloading PDFs from the Mises Institute or the Cato Institute. But if you tell them like, no, this is an ideology about how to get yours, and like the world is a battlefield, we're still on the savannah, then a lot of people can, lend weight to something that might otherwise be seen as amoral or, like against basic human ethics.
You just reminded me of something when you were talking about, like, buying a city block with a gold coin after the crisis. Like a film franchise where like that happens. It's John Wick.
Okay.
So in John Wick, in the criminal underworld, you pay for everything with these gold coins. And I remember finding it really funny because he has to get rid of a dead body, and he calls this like culturally really insensitive depiction of an Irishman, and then like pays him with like fucking doubloons. And I was like, why is this? I was like, this is really funny. But like the men in the cinema were like, when men were men and they could just kill people and pay for shit with coins. Like there was something about it which was like,
well, that's money. So I've been playing with this idea recently of like vulgar neoliberalism, because I think that's the bastard part. That if you look at what Hayek was saying in the 1930s or 40s or 50s and what other neoliberals were saying, it was like, we must defend, the spontaneous order of the market, and we must do that through abstract principles, but also through lawcraft, designing constitutions, designing forms of federation. And the newer version that I get into with the gold bugs, with the people aggressively defending like masculine superiority, is kind of like a mask off version of that, where it's like, no, this isn't about like abstract principles. It's not about one law for the global economy. It's about like one person getting theirs in like a zero-sum world. And so we're not even going to cloak this in like a high-fluting language of liberty anymore. It's just going to be about like domination, enrichment and power.
Well, I mean, there's a sense that other people aren't really real.
Yeah.
So it's your job to be dominant, and at best they're simps and suckers, and at worst they're NPCs, right?
Yeah.
They have no interiority or life of their own. They're sort of just in service to your own narrative.
Yeah, I mean, so there has been this strain of aristocratic elitism through neoliberal thinking for a while, but it's spat out now, I think, in different ways. So the Hayekian version of that was, we are an intellectual class. We consort in seminar rooms and Viennese coffee houses. And if you are able to, hold your own in conversation with us, then we will actually engage with you regardless of your politics. So Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek were famous for having socialists and, social democrats in their circle, more hard conservatives, Christians, as well as their more evolutionary libertarians. So that was always part of the idea for Hayek, was like, you need to convince the opinion makers in society. He called them the secondhand dealers in ideas. He's like, you've got the intellectuals, then you've got journalists, publicists, you've got maybe even filmmakers, you've eventually got philanthropists who can fund the think tanks. So it's about capturing this like narrow band at the top of civil society. And once you capture them, you can say, let's make a bunch of new laws and keep the masses basically in check. So even if they want to do this or that, we'll have changed the laws, we'll have locked in austerity, we'll have locked in, open tendering and cost cutting, whatever it is, to make sure that they don't let their socialistic tendencies loose. By the 1990s, this guy Murray Rothbard, who I write a lot about there, who is incidentally sort of the patron saint of Javier Milei, Argentina. By the 90s, Rothbard says, we've had this upside down, actually. The masses aren't socialist. They haven't been for a while. Actually, the masses are on our side. The masses believe in the wisdom of the market. They believe in getting theirs. They believe in competition. They believe in individual enrichment. The only socialists left are the ones in that small stratum.
And that's where the whole cultural Marxism thing comes in.
Exactly. So the PMC, the managerial elite, they're the ones who still have this socialist idea, this delusion that they're still reproducing in their seminar rooms and in their think tanks. And so what we need to do, the new neoliberal strategy, is not create laws from the top down, but use the people in what Murray Rothbard called a strategy of paleo-populism, or the revolution of white Euro males, or an outreach to the redneck strategy, to go upwards and destroy that thin stratum of the elite. So this is a total reversal of what we assume to be the neoliberal strategy. And it also leaves that question of who the elite is in question, right? Because on the one hand, it seems to be quite like equalizing. Hey, we're all in this, it's the people against the elite. But if you look at the way someone like Rothbard thinks, the people are really only kind of a tiger that you ride to get to the other side of the new order. So this was Julius Evola's, the Italian fascist, has this idea of riding the tiger, which means there's an aristocrat of the soul who is able to see what's happening and will ride the decline through the Kali Yuga, like the end times. And at the end, they just hop off the tiger and then build something new in the ruins.
And that's the sort of the Dominic Cummings, the, possibly Steve Bannon as well, the sense of like, okay, well, you've got the like huge swathes of the country has been left behind and ultimately, been made poorer by globalization. Even if you're accounting for the impact of being able to buy cheaper goods, I think for the average American without a college degree, they're $2,000 a year worse off because of free trade agreements with lower income countries. We can take this anger, which is real, and material, and has material sources, and they've got good reasons to hate the Brahmin caste of Democrats and your Clintons and whatnot. And we're gonna go, right, we're gonna ride that tiger straight at you. And, same here when it comes to Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the question is, what do you do once you've smashed it up? And there, I think someone like Rothbard would probably differ from someone like Bannon. I think that Bannon, at least in his own terms, and there's a certain way that I do believe him, thinks that they can do a kind of shock reindustrialization. Like you put up these crazy tariffs and like everyone's going to be poor for a bit, but then like America will lift itself up slowly, like a sleeping giant or whatever. Whereas someone like Rothbard and the more extreme characters in the book aren't confident of that happening at all. They basically take for granted that the whole country isn't going to make it, basically, that there will be a culling of surplus populations once the welfare state is truly gone. And then there'll be a radical decentralization. So you'll start to rebuild from the small level up what they called contractual communities, in which you won't have a social contract imposed from outside. You'll choose your own arrangement and, opt in to what kind of a community you want. And that might be different from the one down the street. You might have leftists there and Christians here and, libertarian libertines here. So that's the vision for some of the more radical Hayek's bastards in the book. But I think they all have in common this idea of an instrumentalization of mass anger and mass mobilization instead of an attempt to disempower and calm and restrain the masses, which had been very much the theme until the 1990s.
I'm just going back a little bit back to, the kind of like hardwired differences between races. Is there, I might be reaching, but is there maybe like a little bit of a parallel in something which I have noticed on the socially progressive left over the last few years, which, while hostile to the idea of hardwired differences and genetic difference and biological difference, is really taken with the idea that experience can be so different that solidarity or a universal humanist project is basically impossible. So the experience of racism between a black person and a non-black person of color is so irreducibly different that you can't have a shared political project. Has this idea of, extreme insurmountable difference. It's not just something which captured the new fusionists, but there was something in it that the left took on as well.
Yeah, no, I think that idea of like epigenetic trauma and the idea of like the body keeps the score. I mean, talking about books that have stayed on the bestseller list for a really long time. I mean, that one's probably been on there longer than most. Just the idea that, experiences, either individual or collective, can actually change our physiology. Not something I really have an interpretation of either way, but definitely pointing towards a different kind of politics. Arguably also, though, one that works against any kind of collective mobilization and suggests that, there has to be some level of sorting according to people's, individual trajectories to the present moment. So I think there is something there about the fetishization of difference that the people in my book talk about that did kind of resonate with the 1990s era, similar fetishization of difference and the undercutting of like cosmopolitanism, universalism as like bad things that we needed to work against in favor of difference. So that idea of living with difference is actually had its own history on the left too. I think you're right.
How important was the website VDare for bringing together the threads of, apocalyptic demographic change, race, immigration, and how is it also shaped by, I think you call it like smash and grab 1980s neoliberalism?
Yeah. So that I have a chapter in the book called the Ethno economy, and the idea being there that when we talk about the far right, strictly in terms of wanting to build an ethno state, sometimes we bracket like, well, what kind of economic order is supposed to exist inside of those? Hence, the subtitle in the US is The Capitalism of the Far Right. And the person I use into that topic is this guy, Peter Brimelow, who is British born, ended up
We don't claim him.
claims you. Ends up in the United States and Canada, and is a financial reporter for a very long time. Writes for the Financial Post in Canada and Forbes and Fortune in the US, and ends up being now, known as one of the most important proponents of nativism, sometimes referred to as the godfather of the alt-right, quote unquote, partially because he started this website you mentioned, vdare.com, named after Virginia Dare, the first white girl born in the New World. And he was a topic of some discussion around 2016, 17, when people were doing all these explainers of like, what the heck is the alt-right? Who are these people? And he was one person people would mention, like, he's this fire-breathing opponent of immigration, da-da. But rarely would they say, who worked in the financial press for 15, 20 years? And I thought that was a meaningful exclusion. And when I went back and walked through his career, reading his whole oeuvre of columns, you can see how he built up his argument about exclusion and nativism through an economic logic. So it wasn't. Well, he said he adopted some of this idea of hardwired human nature to say that some groups have, higher intelligence than others. Therefore, even though you might want the labor, let's say, of a Mexican worker, you're actually creating a long-term problem for yourself because you're creating a welfare dependent. This is just his fantasy version of telling the story. So you want to prioritize immigrants from high IQ countries, and therefore, birthright citizenship, family reunification policy, chain migration, these are all absolutely invalid. And we need to, for the sake of American economic health, produce harder borders and a much more selective mechanism for who gets in.
And something like mixed race relationships and mixed race families would be a...
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Dinesh D'Souza. He has one of the most mean-spirited reviews I've ever read of Dinesh D'Souza, which targets the fact that, Dinesh D'Souza's, the mother of his children was, I don't know, like Scots-Irish or something. And so he said, what is my daughter? She is this, that, Indian, Scottish, Irish. Like, what would her race even be? You can't call it a race. We're in a post-racial world. And Brimelow says, oh, I sure can. And did like a skull measuring, like race science
calipers came
definition of D'Souza's daughter, and says like, just because you deny the existence of race science doesn't mean it like comes home into your family too. And it was like, oh my God, like this is National Review author against National Review author. And it showed for me quite starkly how some of the most important schisms were not necessarily like left versus right, but within the right, questions of, are we going to go back to the idea of like genetically determined racial difference? Some say yes. Others, thankfully said no. And that ended up producing real rifts in communities.
But I mean, just on that, I mean, if you had to have a look at the right in the UK and Canada, US and elsewhere, who do you think's winning? The civic nationalists or the ethno-nationalists? Because just about a month ago, there was a big old debate here in Britain about, is Rishi Sunak English? I asked Matt Goodwin to his face. I was like, do you think I'm English? And he got very awkward about it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he ultimately said yes. And then his audience got very angry at him. And he went, well, not ethnically, obviously.
Oh, wow.
Yikes. So it's something which is coming up here. So who's winning, the civic nationalists or the ethno-nationalists?
Well, I mean, as a sidebar, it's worth noting, last time I was in London, I was interviewed by this magazine called Spears. Have you heard of it? It's like, you wouldn't have heard of it because you can basically only get it in the lounges for charter private planes.
That's why I've never read it.
And who's a columnist? Matt Goodwin.
No.
Yeah. So a lovely moment where the plutocratic populist sort of horseshoe is produced, especially elegantly. But who's winning? Well, the economistic attitude for sure, and with or without open racial coloring, right? So the interesting thing about this relatively recent past of the 1990s, looking so foreign to me, looking back at it in the pages of this book, is in the late 1980s, the Wall Street Journal used to publish the same column every 4th of July, which said we need to add a new amendment to the Constitution, which said there shall be open borders. That's what they meant. They meant remove the border at the southern border of the US, Mexico, and let everyone move both ways as they like. Inconceivable now. Totally inconceivable. And Brimelow was one of the first people to, propose a new way of thinking about immigration that aligned more with, shifting realities, shifting winds of economics and politics, that is much more now in line with just mainstream understandings, which is like no party is ever going to even like come within 100 yards of the idea of open borders. It's just a question of like how fine should the filter be, and on what basis do we make the filter defined. And that's where you would think that there's two options. Either you choose based on ethnicity and common bloodline, or you choose based on skills at some abstract level. The interesting thing about what's happening, I think, is it's a combination of both. So the US has been a good host for this recently. Late last year, probably remember the dust up between Steve Bannon and Laura Loomer and the more like nativist Groyper faction of the MAGA coalition with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Ramaswamy and Musk said we still need these temporary worker visas, these skilled worker visas called H-1B visas. For Silicon Valley, there's certain things that, we always just need new software engineers, basically. And Bannon and Loomer said, no way, American jobs for Americans. That's not what MAGA is about. Lots of people were watching this saying like, ooh, they're fighting. This is going to get ugly. And then rubbing their hands a bit if they're critics. Fair enough. But then it just kind of went away. And, Trump, through his silence, sort of, let his children fight it out and then let them come to some, apparent resolution, which then became more obvious how he was going to resolve this in the first weeks and months of his administration, when he did two things. One was, theatrical deportations, putting people on military planes, even though it actually didn't fit more people in, doing things that were very high profile with, of course, dissident students and so on. Two, announcing the gold card. And what was the gold card? He said this will replace our previous citizenship by investment program. And the way he described it was extremely interesting. He said, if you're a Indian, Japanese, Chinese person who goes to Harvard, Wharton, or Princeton, and you want to stay in this country for $5 million, you can buy citizenship in this country. So it was like this remarkable moment where the idea of what I call folk capital, the idea that there are certain races and ethnicities that are economically valuable because of their high IQ, and Trump is obsessed with the idea of IQ, can then be actually monetized and given a citizenship value, in this case, $5 million. And that apparent division between an ethno state and a capitalist, colorblind state actually diffuses into one another.
I mean, the IQ status of South Asians is a really interesting one to me, because there's sort of two stories, and sometimes you can hear them simultaneously. One is Indian software engineer, doctor, pharmacist, your Rishi Sunak model. Do you know what I mean? Like,
model minority,
Yeah, right, buttoned up. And then the other is sort of like weirdly scatological, and Twitter is a good place.
The camp of the saints kind of narrative.
Yeah, right. Like, you're disgusting. You've risen from the sewer. You are
the Calcutta
uncivilized.
slum story.
Right. And so, like, one of the things which I get called a lot online is a low IQ Bengali. And I was like, at least they got the Bengali bit right. You know what I mean? Like, that's an improvement on the, 90s, like, Paki's out. I was like, so they got something. So, like, how do you think that
Baby
shakes
steps.
out? Because on the one hand, you've got, model minority, you can pay $5 million, you can get this, like, gold card citizenship. And on the other is this deeply dehumanizing image. So, like, where do you think the South Asian is going to end up? Are we going to be software people or sewer people?
Well, I think it depends on the country context, because in the US, that stigma of like welfare dependence and, risen from the sewers and so on is occupied by other races, I would say, in the right-wing imagination. So Haitians have played a very important role, especially since the 90s and into the recent presidential and vice presidential campaign. And then, of course, people from Hispanic, Latino countries are the ones who are seen as the bad immigrants. South Asians tend to be either the software engineers or the motel gas station operators, right? Think of the Apu stereotype from Simpsons, the convenience store. So, fulfilling important service roles relatively innocuously and perhaps less objectionable than people who are theoretically at least, amassed at the border ready to swarm in. So I think the absence of a post-imperial relationship to South Asia and the Great Distance somehow seems to diffuse that. But yeah, no, I think it's still part of the dynamic that I try to capture through the return of the genre spy Camp of the Saints narrative via Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, which features this thing called the Raft, which is like this gigantic Camp of the Saints like flotilla of decommissioned ships just bouncing around the Pacific that occasionally will come close to shore, and everyone pays for alert systems like the raft is coming, which is cynically captures, I think, a lot of that totally hysterical fear of a coming invasion. And when there were movements of people from Latin America in the first Trump administration, Bannon seemed to be quite expressly drawing on the vision of the Camp of Saints to talk about, how there was there wasn't a flotilla, but there was what was it called? A cavalcade or something. There was a parade of people coming.
Oh, caravan.
A caravan.
The migrant caravan.
Yes, exactly. The migrant caravan. So I think another thing I'm trying to get to there is the way that these tropes from science fiction and cyberpunk kind of get folded into the more speculative wings of especially like the libertarianism that comes out of the Silicon Valley to remix old racialized and demographic threats.
I want to talk about Elon Musk for a second.
Yeah.
Because
always happy to do that.
What a weird fucking guy.
Yeah.
When you think about his approach to having children, so something like 14 kids that we know of, and 12 out of those 14 were assigned male at birth. I mean, what's all that about?
IVF.
But why? Why does he want
sex selection?
Yeah, why does he want so many male children?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, he has a very tortured relationship to masculine authority, that was inculcated in him early through his extremely tempestuous relationship to his father, Errol, who, among other things, has had children with his former stepdaughter, Errol. And when asked about that in a recent interview, when asked what it was like to have been a stepfather to someone who he then had children with, he assured the interviewer that she had many stepfathers after that. So, I mean, when you're raised with that as a male archetype, I think it was both something he was rightfully repelled by and didn't speak to his father for a long time and tried to keep his distance. But then it's, one can leave, but can you ever leave these kind of impressions, unfortunately? And he seems to have reverted back to the mean of a lot of like South African white border siege mentality that brings with it this idea of being a minority population that needs to expand the patriarchal clan as quickly and as, as prodigiously as possible to have your own private army against the incoming hordes.
What does Trump get from him?
He gets a lot. Are you kidding? He's the richest man in the world. I mean, what don't you get from the richest man in the world? I think he got a lot of credibility for a certain class of voter. I actually wouldn't understate the achievements that Musk has pulled off, mainstreaming the consumer electric vehicle, becoming the first commercial spaceflight and launch provider, basically just kicking Boeing and NASA right out of the building and becoming the person who does things like fill the night sky with 50% of the satellites up there to provide an alternative form of internet provision in a world where grids are ever less dependable. the power wall system of energy storage in places with unreliable electrical grids like Puerto Rico or Western Australia is a lifeline, actually, for people. So he's done an extraordinary amount of arguably socially productive things. Unfortunately, he's burnt all of that capital symbolically and morally by trying to stoke the fires of some of the most divisive and, hateful politics that exist in the world. And now he's become the megaphone for the far right worldwide.
Was it a Nazi salute that he did at the inauguration?
I haven't decided yet. I mean, on the one hand, like when Bannon did it himself at CPAC a couple of days later, then it was the meta Nazi salute, right? So then it was clearly his intention to mimic a Nazi salute and then bait the left and see how they would respond. Whether or not Musk was out to do that, I think it's hard to say but I think that he has moments where he tries to convince himself that he's a naughty troll, and he thinks that will, please some important people in his life, I suppose. And so it must have been a moment like that where he thought that he'd be able to, please the cool kids somehow, which in his mind, I guess, are the neo-Nazis. And ironically, even they turned against him. So if I didn't check
over the
myself,
H1B thing.
No, like if you go on 8chan or something, apparently after the inauguration, people were like, he's not even a real Nazi.
Don't wear Thrasher if you don't skate, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, it's like a Mobius strip of hermeneutic interpretation that I try to stay out of a bit myself. But more interesting, I think, is the political economy of someone like Musk and the way that it's trying to, turn the entire US economy towards things like expanding the military state, maxing out extraction to feed the mouth of Grok and his AI systems, and, shred all regulations towards what he sees as like the multiplanetary civilization, having only his cars on the road. I mean, this is all something that to me is much more consequential than like the semiotics of his posting behavior.
Or like the multi-planetary civilization where like one of his awful sons is in charge of like each solar system or something. It's like Max in space. Ugh. I mean, I've got one last question, which is something really important, and a distinction that you draw in the book is that this isn't a backlash against neoliberalism. It's a front lash. So looking at the next 4 years of Trump, thinking about the direction of Milei in Argentina, I mean, where's that front lash gonna go?
Yeah, I mean, Milei is an interesting one, I think, because he really is a true believer, right? I mean, he's a trained economist. He sees himself as a disciple of some of the people I describe in the book. He sees himself as a follower of Murray Rothbard. His closest mentors include people who are members of the Mont Pelerin Society, Alberto Benegas Lynch, Jesus Huerta de la Soto. So he's very much in this world of like right-wing neoliberals. It takes no leap of interpretation. When he met Vivek Ramaswamy, as I mentioned in the conclusion, they greeted each other, and Ramaswamy said, "You're more of a Mises guy. I'm more of a Hayek guy." And Milei said, "No, but we're both Rothbard guys." So, if you do the kind of intellectual history I do, occasionally you're like, what am I doing here? Like, does any of this even matter? Is it connected to the real world? And something like that happens, you're like, okay, thank you. Like, yes.
I really needed that, guys.
This plugs right in. Yes, thank you for, validating me, Javier. Your economy only had to suffer for it. But, if you look at him, I described him in a New Statesman piece as a monster of the mainstream. I mean, he's actually doing everything that like the finance markets want, right? The FT loves Milei. Actually love him even more now than they did at the beginning. They're a little concerned at the beginning, but now they're like, he's actually doing what he said. And he's like smoothing the return of creditworthiness by his draconian cuts to cultural programs, his cuts on wages, his rollback on all kinds of rights. So as far as capital is concerned, even global capital, he's actually a hero. I mean, when he went to Davos and addressed the audience and said, you guys are the value creators. Outside are all the communists and the feminists and the Green parties and the Christian Democrats, and went down the list of like everyone that neoliberals have opposed since like 1947. He got a rousing round of applause, and Neil Ferguson and others praised him for his speech afterwards. So he's a very good, to me, figure of the kind of front lash I was trying to describe, right, appears to be a renegade, appears to be a creature of the right, appears to be completely culturally retrograde in certain ways, and yet does seem to be doing behind the scenes everything that the financial class would want. The current ruling set of policy advisors in the Trump administration is, I think, of a slightly different quality. The fact that you're America means you have leash that Argentina does not. You are, the issuer of the world's reserve currency. You are the world's biggest economy still, perhaps not for long, but still. So you have latitude and room for maneuver that allows for extremely risky forms of economic experimentation, which we are witnessing right now. Like the Liberation Day tariffs are of a kind that, if you look at the graphs of like relative tariff rates, I mean, it's above the 1930s. Like actually, the United States since the 19th century has never had these kind of barriers to trade. Any other country would be immediately just like expelled from the world economy by doing this. They can do it because they are America. And there are people inside of the Trump administration, I think, who have these ideas like maybe we can just have a period of quote unquote detox, have a period of maybe like low growth or even degrowth. But in the process, we will self-strengthen. We will maybe get back on a martial footing. Maybe we will even have to have a small war to bring a sense of meaning back into the lives of young men. But afterwards, we will be more autonomous than ever, and we won't be so dependent on these foreign countries for the production of all of our goods. And that's the kind of thought process going through the minds of some of the national conservatives and paleo-conservatives that actually bears no relationship to the neoliberal heritage at all by that time, right? When Hayek and company got together in the 1930s, they got together to oppose that kind of thing. They got together to oppose the idea that political will should rule economic rationality at every moment and should have a kind of ability to reorganize the world based only from the demands of the nation rather than the needs of the world economy. They wanted to speak for the world economy at some level, which there are very few people inside of the Trump administration doing right now, whereas someone like Milei arguably is in a weird way. He's like, not the hero we wanted, but the hero we need for the Davos crowd, right? And I can't see anyone looking at the Navaros or the Bessents of the Trump administration that way. Rather, they're really out on a limb now and doing improvisational dancing of a kind that everyone is just looking at agog and say, what are they trying to convey? And nobody
flip table, see what happens.
Nobody knows. Yes. And so in that sense, I understand in a way why there's some people on the kind of post-left who say, what are you being critical of? This is great. Like the consensus is gone. All bets are off. Like neoliberalism has been killed by its own makers. Why aren't we, ourselves like tap dancing the streets now? Because like a window has been opened for a brave and interesting new world. Reason I'm not joining them is because the way that the game is still being rigged, I think, is, extraordinarily weighted against ordinary working people. And the kinds of experimentation they're doing right now is still designed in such a way to maximally enrich a very small group of insiders and to maximally dispossess and make life harder for the larger group of outsiders.
But there's something libidinal about it, isn't it?
Oh,
so like the left look at it and they go, someone's doing something,
yeah.
and you're saying eat my shorts, and I feel, even though I hate you and I'm implacably opposed to your project, I feel alive because of it. There's a bit of that in there.
Yeah, no, there is. And I think that, that is part of what the end of history was about, right? People sometimes
Poor
forget.
Francis. He's never lived that essay down.
No, well, I was just going to actually salvage his reputation because, if you read it, as many people don't, he was very down key about the end of history, right? He's like, this will be a very sad time. This will be a time of men with hollow chests who will not be able to find meaning. And the point of that essay is from the Nietzsche, Zarathustra walking around and giving these lectures to people in church squares and saying, like, the last man will be someone who is not able to find meaning in the world. And people are like, who is this last man? We want to be the last man. And so for Fukuyama, this was a tragic ending for history. And what we're getting back is actually what he was saying we had lost, which is like a sense of conflict and recognition and is a desire for struggle. So all of those things, like there you go, like we have them in spades now. But whether or not that will offer anything other than like a frisson of excitement before the time of misery remains to be seen.
What a note to end on. Quinn
Yeah, no, I
Slobodian.
specialize in those. My thing.
You're like, yeah, if there'll be anything other than misery in the years to come.
We didn't even
remains
talk
to be
about
seen.
autonomous drone swarms because that's somewhere in the repertoire too. But
Ugh, autonomous drone swarms. That's a Richard Hames question. And you know it.
Yeah,
Quinn Slobodian, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
It's happy to be here.